Hello viewers, in this video I will try to talk about a novel and the title, sorry, not a novel, it is a play. So the title of the play is The Rover or The Behn Cavaliers. It is a play written in two parts by the English author Aphra Behn, and it is a revision of Thomas Killigrew's play Tommaso or the Wanderer, which was published in 1664, and it features multiple plot lines dealing with the amorous adventures of a group of Englishmen and women in Naples at carnival time. And according to Restoration poet John Dryden, this play it lacks the manly vitality of Killigrew's play, but it shows greater refinement of expression. Besides, the play it stood for 3 centuries as Behn's most popular and most respected play. So it was a little introduction about this play. Now we have to know what is Restoration comedy. Since this play is related to Restoration comedy, that's why we have to know about it. So the Restoration comedy, it is an English comedy, and Restoration comedy, these are written and performed in the Restoration period of 1660 to 1710, and comedy of manners is used as a synonym for this. After public stage performances were banned for 18 years by the Puritan regime, reopening the theaters in the 1600, it marked a renaissance of English drama. Consequently, sexually explicit language was encouraged by King Charles II. His timeline was 1660 to 1685, personally, and by the rakish style of his court. Okay, so that was a little bit introduction or brief information about Restoration comedy. Now let's try to know about this play's writer or playwright. Aphra Behn, she was born on 14 December 1640 and died on 16 April 1689. She was an English playwright, poet, prose writer, and translator from the Restoration era. And she, as one of the first English women to earn her living by her writing. She had broken cultural barriers and served as a literary role model for later generations of women authors. Rising from obscurity, she also came to the notice of Charles II, who employed her as a spy in Antwerp. Upon her return to London and a probable brief stay in debtor's prison, she began writing for the stage. And she belonged to a coterie of poets and famous libertines such as John Wilmot, Lord Rochester. Besides, Aphra Behn wrote under the pastoral pseudonym Astrea during the turbulent political times of the exclusion crisis. She wrote an epilogue and prologue that brought her into legal troubles. And she thereafter devoted most of her writing to prose genres and translations. And a staunch supporter of the Stuart line, she had declined an invitation from Bishop Burnet to write a welcoming poem to the new King William III. But she died shortly after that. So that was a brief introduction about author. Now let's try to know the summary of this play. In the act one of this play, we got to know that sisters Helena and Florida's fates have been decided for them by the men in their life, mainly their brother and father. Helena is to enter the convent after carnival has ended. Florida's father wants her to marry elderly Don Vincentio, and her brother Don Pedro, who wants her to marry Don Antonio. However, she has feelings for Belville and English Cornell. The women, they are not approving of these plans. They dress up for carnival in an attempt to avoid their chosen fates. Then Belville, Blunt, Frederick, and Wilmore, they are also enjoying carnival when they run into Florinda, Helena, and Valeria, their cousin. Wilmore and Helena, they flirt with one another. Helena agrees to meet Wilmore again later. Meanwhile, Lucetta begins to seduce Blunt. Then Florinda begins to set up a meeting with Belville when she sees her brother approaching. Moreover, she hastily gives him a letter and runs off with Helena and Valeria. Then Florida's letter contains instruction for Belville to come to her garden at 10 that night and carry her off. Then Blood sneaks off with Lucetta. So that was a little summary of brief one. Now let's try to know act one. Now let's try to know what is depicted in the act 2 of this play. In the act 2, we got to know that Wilmore, Belville, and Frederick, they go to see Anglica, a famous courtesan, and Anglica's servants they hang up a portrait of her outside of her house, and the Englishmen are astounded by her beauty, but leave when they realize they do not have the money to buy her. 1,000 crowns a month, and Don Pedro they enter Don Pedro enters and sees the picture and the price, and he has the money and runs to fetch it. Anglica then laments that no one has taken her up because of the high price, but when she learns of Don Pedro and Don Antonio, both of whom are rich, she decides to pursue them, then goes back inside. Pedro then soon enters from one side of the stage, and Antonio enters from the other. Both men are then masked. Antonio is also struck by Anglica's portrait and wonders out loud if he could get away with sleeping with Anglica and still marry Florinda. At the mention of Florinda, Pedro recognizes Antonio. They fight. Wilmore and Blunt enter and break them up. Pedro then challenges Antonio to a duel the next day over Anglica, and Antonio accepts it. Meanwhile, Wilmore also sees a smaller picture of Anglica and tries to steal it. Then Antonio tells him to put it back, and Wilmore refuses and says that Antonio has the money to pay for the real thing, and Anglica enters just in time to see another fight break out. And Anglica also asked Wilmore to speak with her inside, as she was initially very excited and impressed by him. Then Wilmore goes despite Belvile and Frederick's fears that Anglica is angry with him. On the other hand, Wilmore also tries to persuade Anglica to sleep with him for free. Normally, Anglica would not agree to this, but she has fallen in love with Wilmore, with his wits and his way. Then she agrees despite the warnings from her maid servant, Moreta. Then in Act 3, we got to know that Helena says that she is not in love, but she cannot stop thinking about Wilmore. Then the women, Belvile, Blunt, and Frederick, they approach and eavesdrop on the man. Then Belvile, Blunt, and Frederick, they have come to retrieve Wilmore from Anglica because he has been inside with her for 2 hours. And Wilmore comes out and brags about having enjoyed Anglica's charms for free. Helena, on the other hand, who has seen and heard everything Wilmore said, comes out of hiding and pretends as if nothing has transpired. Furthermore, as Wilmore begins to flirt with her again, then Anglica enters masked and sees Wilmore betraying the vows he made to her. Then Helena finally reveals her face to Wilmore, who praises her beauty. This is the last straw for Anglica. She orders one of her servants to find out who Helena is and storms out. Helena then asks what Wilmore was doing in Anglica's house. Then he denies that anything transpired. Helena then attacks him, quoting to him what he had just said about Anglica. Then she makes Wilmore promise never to see Anglica again. Meanwhile, Florinda and Valeria are testing Belvile's loyalty to Florinda by trying to seduce him while he does not know who they are, and he stands firm. Then the women exit, but Florinda leaves Belvile with a locket. Belvile then recognizes Florinda's picture in the locket and resolves to rescue her that night with Wilmore and Frederick's help. Meanwhile, Blunt is tricked out of his money and clothes by Lucetta. On the other hand, Florinda waits in her garden for Belvile wearing a nightgown. Then Wilmore enters drunk, and he mistakes Florinda for a prostitute and tries to persuade her to sleep with him. Then when she resists, he attempts to rape her, but when Belvile and Frederick enter, then Florinda runs off. Wilmore and Belvile, they almost fight, but Frederick intervenes, and the noise, however, brings Pedro and his servants to the garden, and a fight breaks out, and the English are driven off. Then Wilmore also tries to explain to a furious Belvile that he didn't know who Florinda was and mistook her for a whore, and Belvile and Frederick, they leave to find Florinda. However, Antonio enters then, and hoping that his page has paid Angelica so he can sleep with her. Then Wilmore sees these and starts a fight with Antonio. Antonio also falls wounded. Wilmore also believes he has killed Antonio and runs off. And Belvile also runs in, fearing that it is Wilmore who has been hurt. Then soldiers enter and arrest Belvile, believing him to be the attacker. And Antonio finds his strength and orders Belvile taken to his house. So now we have reached in the Act 4. Now let's try to know what has happened in Act 4. So in Act 4, Don Antonio does not believe that Belvile is innocent of having injured him. However, he also offers Belvile an alternative to imprisonment. Then since Antonio is wounded and cannot duel Belvile could dress up as Antonio and go instead. Then Belvile agrees, believing the fight to be over. over Florinda. Then Florinda frets that Belville did not come to her window as planned and fears that the impending duel is between Belville and Pedro. And Pedro enters masked and reveals that he will be fighting and Antonio, relieving some of Florinda's fears. Then Belville enters disguised as Antonio, and Florinda runs in to stop them. Then Belville is confused as to why Florinda would defend his rival, but they push her away and fight. Florinda then stops them again, just as Belville disarms Pedro. Then she begs him to spare Pedro. Belville then lays his sword at Florinda's feet and swears his love to her. Then the action redeems him in Pedro's eyes, so he gives his sister to the man he believes to be Antonio, demanding that they get married at once. Florinda then protests, but Belville secretly lifts his mask to show her who he is. Then just then Wilmore and Frederick enter. Wilmore greets him by embrace. The embrace makes Belville drop his mask. Pedro now refuses to allow the wedding since it was Antonio's fight, not Belville's. Then he drags Florinda away, accusing her of trying to trick him. Then Belville, furious at being thwarted yet again, turns on Wilmore and chases him away. And Anglica enters with her servants Moreta and Sebastian, then furious that Wilmore loves Helena. On the other hand, Sebastian runs after Wilmore to bring him back, and Anglica accuses Wilmore of having another woman. Wilmore, as usual, attempts to charm her back. Then Helena enters disguised as a man. She decides to interfere and approaches Anglica, pretending to be one of Helena's servants. Then she tells a story about a young girl who fell in love and was left standing at the altar because her lover came to Anglica. Then she reveals the lover to be Wilmore. Anglica is moved by the story, and Wilmore is only excited and impatient to find out who the woman in question is. Then suddenly Wilmore recognizes Helena and figures out what is going on. Then he turns to Anglica and starts describing Helena as a gypsy, ugly, and a monkey, etc. Then he tells Helena to go back to her mistress. Then Anglica is outraged with Wilmore and vows to take revenge and sends Wilmore away. In that way, Wilmore exits with an aside in which he says he plans to try to win Helena back. Then Florinda and Valeria enter disguised in different costumes, having momentarily escaped Pedro. Then Don Pedro, Belville, and Wilmore, they enter. Pedro and Belville, they seem to be having a serious kind of conversation. Then Wilmore follows Florinda when she walks past, again thinking she is a courtesan. Then Frederick comes in and relates Blunt's misadventures to Belville and Pedro. They all go off to find him. Florinda then re-enters, still being chased by Wilmore. Then Helena arrives and sees Wilmore pursuing this unknown woman. Then she sends a page to find out where they go. Florinda then ducks into a door to avoid Wilmore. It turns out to be Belville's house. Then the page Helena goes off to relay the information. So in that way, Blunt is staying in Belville's house. Florinda then enters, sees Blunt and asks him for help. But Blunt then attempts to rape her based on his new contempt for women. Frederick then enters, also convinced that Florinda is a prostitute, and joins Blunt. And Florinda gives them a diamond ring and asks them to consult Belville. And Frederick fears that she might be a lady of some worth and asks Blunt to wait. And Blunt is still skeptical but agrees. And Frederick in that way locks Florinda in a room. So that's it about Act 4. Now let's try to know about Act 5. So in Act 5, we got to know that Belville, Wilmore, Frederick, and Pedro, they break into Blunt's room and laugh at him. Then Blunt says that just a moment before there was a wench in his chamber and shows them the ring Florinda gave him. Belville then recognizes the ring as the one he gave Florinda when they exchange vows. Then the other men, unaware that the girl is Florinda, they decide to let her out and have their way with her. Then they draw swords to see who has the longest. Then the Don Pedro wins and unlocks Florinda's door. In that way, Florinda runs in and still masked and pursued by Pedro. She is safe when Valeria arrives and persuades Pedro to leave by telling him that Callis knows where Florinda is hiding. Once he is gone, Florinda removes her mask. Valeria then tells Belville and Florinda to get married quickly before Pedro returns. Frederick and Valeria then decide to get married as well. Then Belville sends a boy to fetch a priest. Then Frederick and Blunt, they realize that they almost raped Florinda and apologize, returning the ring. Florinda then forgives them, and Belville, Florinda, Valeria, and Frederick, they exit to get married. Blunt goes up to see a tailor. Then Wilmore stays behind to guard against Pedro's return. In that way, Anglica enters, pointing a pistol at Wilmore. She rages at him while threatening him with the gun, and Wilmore offers to pay her for her services, but she refuses. And as she prepares to kill him, Don Antonio enters with his arm in a sling, and he takes the gun from Anglica, then recognizes Wilmore as the man who
who stole Anglica's picture. Then he offers to shoot Wilmore, and Pedro enters. Anglica, in that way, decides to let Wilmore leave and leaves. Then he leaves. So Don Pedro then asks why Don Antonio missed the duel. Then Antonio tells him what had happened and left in a huff. Pedro then decided to give Florinda to Belville in a revenge, and Wilmore informed him that the marriage has already occurred. Then Pedro had existed. In that way, we got to know that Helena entered still in boys' clothes and banters with Wilmore, who wants to sleep with her but does not want to marry her. Then Helena finally convinces him for marriage, and Pedro, Belville, Florinda, Frederick, and Valeria they enter in the stage, and they learn of Wilmore and Helena's engagement. And Pedro approves, and he was tired of fearing for his sister's honor or virginity. But Blunt enters in a Spanish habit, looking ridiculous, and music plays, and maskers from Carbinal come in dancing. The play ends with vows of love between Helena and Wilmore. So in that way, it ends. Please read the original text; otherwise, it will be futile and useless.